Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I am very excited about today's speaker. As somebody who focuses on East Asia and Japan, I'm always eager for people to come talk to us about this, and so all the more delighted to have today's speaker with us, braving the cold and the ice and everything else that he has to face on the way. The growth of Chinese wealth and military power, as I'm sure of you have noticed, has emerged as the central issue in American foreign policy these days. It's obviously got the potential to affect East Asian security policy. It has the potential to affect the regional and the global economy. And all too often, however, we talk about China's rise in terms of the bilateral context. We talked about China's rise with respect to US-China relations. But other countries, particularly America's regional partners, are a key part of this story. And so today we have the good fortune to discuss East Asia by factoring in an important regional player and US ally, Japan. Professor Toshihiro Nakayama is a professor of American politics and foreign policy at Keio University. And he's also an adjunct fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. He's currently spending part of this academic year as a fellow in the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Professor Nakayama is the author of several articles and 2 books on American foreign policy, and at the Wilson Center is working on a project about American retrenchment and the demise of the foreign policy consensus and the American body politic. Professor Nakayama is a great example of a highly engaged scholar with connections to both diplomacy and the media. I know him from bilateral study groups that get together to talk about managing the US-Japan relationship. And also, he was previously a special correspondent for the Washington Post and its Far Eastern Bureau. He writes a monthly column for Japan News, and he is a regular participant in the Japanese media, analyzing relations between Japan and the United States. Professor Nakayama also worked for the Japanese mission to the United Nations in New York. According to his website, the quote that he would like to impart to students belongs to Mark Twain. The one who doesn't read good books has no advantage over the one who can't read them. So now I'm suddenly feeling very guilty about the stack of books on my nightstand back at home. But for all of the insight he has to share with us today, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Toshihiro Nakayama.
Well, thank you, Professor Lin. I never thought you would quote the quote that I quote from Mark Twain. I was kind of embarrassed you quoting that. I feel guilty myself because I have whole stacks of books that I haven't read. Well, thank you for coming. It seems like Dartmouth University have deep ties with with Japan. I see my friend Dr. Tsukamoto right there. I never expected to see him here, so it was a good surprise. And in fact, I found out that there's some students from my university, Keio University, who's visiting here as an exchange student. And that's all good. And before I sort of start my talk, let me introduce a bit about myself. I teach American politics and foreign policy to Japanese university students, which is a bit tough task to do these days, I guess. And it makes it tougher because I guess as many of you were, I was totally wrong about the sort of the results of the 2016 election. And on that day, on the election day, I was on television talking as though if the other side would win. So I was kind of embarrassed by it. And many of my students saw that, have seen that on TV. So, of course, our job is not about predicting elections, right? But if you do that on TV and if you're totally wrong, you sort of have to accept some part of responsibility. So, they would come up to me and said, you were totally wrong, Professor. What can you teach us about American politics? So it's kind of tough these days. But I've been with 3 universities. Keio is my third. And all the 3 universities had deep ties with the U.S. The first university I taught at was called Tsuda College. It's a first women's university, and the founder of the university came to the United States when she was 5 in 1856 or 60. I got mixed up. But in the mid-19th century, with a group of Japanese, delegation sent by the government of Japan, and she stayed. And for Japan to sort of become a modern nation, she felt the need to establish a women's college, learning from the experience she had in the United States. And so the first university I taught at had a deep sort of relation with the U.S. And the second university that I taught at is called Aoyama Gakuin University. And this university was founded by an American Methodist. So it has deep ties. And Keio University, where I teach, and the founder is one of the sort of intellectual sort of founders of modern Japan, called Fukuzawa, and he was the first to translate the Declaration of Independence and introduced the U.S. Constitution to Japan. So intellectually, I've been very blessed, and I've been at the important places where, U.S.-Japan sort of relations, not just in terms of alliance, but in societal and cultural context, has played a very important role. So today I'm going to tackle, a difficult subject: how we've been navigating the Trump years. It seems it's only 2 years, but it seems a lot longer than that, and I think we've been pretty successful in managing that, and I'll try to sort of talk about the background of how we have been doing that. And maybe I should start out with the 2016 period, looking back at the Obama years. Right? President Obama came out with a policy called rebalance, or the pivot, which meant that U.S. would now focus on the Asia Pacific. And there was like 5 pillars to it. Strengthening relations with allies and partners, focusing on China, trade deals, regional sort of mechanisms, and it was a good list of policy goals. But policy is, I guess, setting priorities, and from this notion of rebalance, it was like a laundry list of what U.S. had to do, and we couldn't figure out what the priorities were. It seemed to us that it was a list of assignments that the U.S. has to accomplish, and where is the core? We weren't really never sure about it. So although President Obama said he would focus on Asia Pacific, we were a bit sort of puzzled, and at least on the receiver's end, we weren't quite sure what it was. And also adding to that, you had a situation in Syria. You all know about the red line debate, right? The President Obama said that if Assad uses the chemical weapon, U.S. would definitely intervene, but he clearly didn't. On Ukraine, yes, he was tough on Russia in terms of the message and sanctions and all that, but the perception was that he could have been tougher. And of course, we totally understand the situation is different, right? Because Syria and Ukraine was about new intervention, whereas situation in Asia, and especially managing of the U.S.-Japan alliance, was more about staying, because U.S. is already there, right? So it was more about management and staying power and all that. But so we understood the difference between the two situations, totally different. But it was about the credibility of the president's word, right? And there were some doubts about that. And in the background, there was a nervousness, especially on the policy side, that President Obama was all about sort of America pulling back, right? Retrenchment. So candidate Clinton was running for the White House, and we thought she would be a very good partner for Japan because, of course, she would be appointing the known, foreign policy and security hands, the establishments. And we saw as a sort of like a tougher version of President Obama, more about sort of American power, robust, foreign policy, and not necessarily about retrenching, and especially vis-a-vis China, she would be, more tougher on China. At least that was the expectation. So we expected even better relations under Hillary Clinton. It's not that, Obama era was totally bad. Right? It started out really bad because on our side, we had a prime minister called Aoyama. He was a bit erratic, and he was skeptical about the alliance, and he even talked about equilateral triangle between U.S., Japan, and China. And that didn't make sense to many of us, but at least that was the vision that he had. And that sort of started out rocky. But, I think we've managed through the Aoyama period. Prime Minister Abe came in for the second time, and I think, it was a good 5 or 6 years, under President Obama and Prime Minister Abe. Of course, the symbolic highlight was President Obama's visit to Hiroshima. I think that was very big, especially among the Japanese public. It was like 96% of the Japanese public appreciated and welcomed President Obama's visit. We never demanded an apology. It was more about reconciliation and sort of remembering the tragedy together. And I think it was, for us at least, at the highlight of the Obama presidency. And there was a reciprocal visit by Prime Minister Abe, visiting Pearl Harbor. Japanese Prime Minister has never done so. But it was possible because President Obama visited Hiroshima. So that was good. And of course there was this Operation Tomodachi. This is sort of the disaster relief from the Great East the earthquake and tsunami that happened in 2011. And the perception of U.S. forces in Japan were a bit mixed. Some were skeptical. But the image improved drastically after, Operation Tomodachi. The dedication of men and women of the U.S. forces in Japan, gave a very sort of positive image about them. So, there were never really chemistries between the two leaders, Trump and Prime Minister Abe and Mr. Obama. But things turned out well. Japan undertook many security policy reform during Prime Minister Abe's period, and I would say it was all embraced by President Obama, fully supported. Right? So I think we were talking in the context of U.S.-Japan relations has matured, so that we don't have to rely on this personal chemistries anymore. Before, back in the 1980s, there was this Ron Yasu, that is Ronald Reagan and Prime Minister Nakasone. They had, a personal chemistry, not like mingling, but they respected each other for their conservative views as a nationalist in a positive sense, I guess. And also we had this, and these two sort of mingled together, right? President Bush and Prime Minister Koizumi. When the two visited Graceland, and Prime Minister Koizumi suddenly started singing with Elvis. You're not even supposed to touch that sunglass, right? but somehow, he wore this Elvis sunglasses and started to sing. Was it "Love Me Tender"? Or I forgot the song, but so it was all about chemistry. But if you look at Obama and Prime Minister Abe, the chemistry is no longer needed. We can work with the U.S. on a policy level. So it seemed like the relations matured. Right? So that was the 2016. During the Obama-Abe period, it wasn't excellent, but it was okay. But there was some doubts about U.S. commitment, and Hillary would be a robust, hawkish version. Maybe hawkish is not the right word, but the robust version of Obama. So, the better days of U.S.-Japan alliance is coming. And we almost never talked about, President Trump, because we didn't think that was happening. Yes, the fact that he went that far worried us, because if you treat, Trump as a phenomenon, it's not really important that he becomes a president. The fact that he was elected as the candidate of the Republican Party itself meant something. So we knew that we had to be worried about that side of things, but we never thought he would become the president of the United States. And I think that is highlighted in the fact that when Prime Minister Abe went to New York to attend the UN General Assembly in September of 2016, Hillary Clinton sort of invited him to have a meeting with him, and he accepted that meeting, I guess, without any hesitation. Right? I guess, I don't know whether Mr. Trump was there in New York at that time, but meeting a prime minister, meeting a certain candidate is like endorsing one to another. Right? So it was sort of like an intervention, but I think we didn't really even care because we thought, Hillary Clinton would win the election. So we found out on of course, the election day that, we were totally wrong. And we went through many sort of thought processes. What does Trump symbolizes? We've heard of American First, American nationalism, that he has sort of antagonized the globalist, and we went into a sort of a deep, a thinking mode. And American nationalism, I think, is about U.S. extending its responsibility too wide. And and this feeling that U.S. is not going to provide a public good or goods at the expense of the American people, and that U.S. is not going to be exploited anymore, and also the multilateral arrangement is something that constrains the U.S. Rather than sort of a forum where sort of global norms and rules and treaties are sort of discussed and agreed upon. He saw the alliances as a burden, and saw the treaties and rules as as an encroachment to U.S. sovereignty. And the message was that we're not going to uphold the liberal international order anymore. I think that message was quite blunt. And needless to say, Japan relies on the alliance, in a major way. But even more than that, we rely on this liberal international order, I would say. Japan does not have the capability to shape the region in its desirable form. We tend to react to the situation that's occurring. And not many countries have the capability to shape the region in a manner that you want it to be. There's only a couple of superpowers who can really do that. And Japan is not in the category. So in order for the regional order or the regional situation to be predictable, we do need to rely on these kind of stable order, which U.S. has been like the backbone since the past, since the World War II ended. Right? So, not just in terms of the alliance, but in terms of liberal international order, we were extremely worried about it. And looking back, through the campaign period, It's has almost become a ritual for the Japanese media to complain that Japan is not mentioned in the speeches of presidential candidates, right? They would sort of word count, how many times China was mentioned and how many times Japan was mentioned. China is always like 20, 30, and Japan is like 0 or 1. And we would be, criticizing that. It's a very silly thing, but it has almost become a ritual in doing that. But, Mr. Trump was totally different, right? He never, forgot to speak about Japan in terms of trade, that Japan he lumped China and Japan together as a, free rider. And he always talked about Japan relying on the U.S.-Japan alliance and not paying. And if you want to be protected, you have to pay, right? That was the blunt message that he was sending us. And also, this is only one, so maybe we shouldn't be sort of focusing on this too much. But he said, Japan can go, not just Japan, he said Korea and Germany, and lumped together some other countries. But he said that Japan can go nuclear if you want. And that's a very, a delicate message, and it touches at the heart of the alliance as well, right? The extended deterrence. So we were quite shocked, naturally. But, there's a famous, well-known, Singaporean ambassador scholar called Birahari Kaushkan. And he wrote after, President Trump was elected that in Asia, we don't complain, we try to adapt, right? And he was talking about the Trump administration. And I think, in a way, Japan went even further than that, and I would say it was a radical adaptation to Mr. Trump and his policies. I would think it would have been very difficult to do this in Europe. Prime Minister May, President Macron, and Chancellor Merkel could never have done what Japan did, I think. And I think there are several reasons behind that. And I would add that Prime Minister Abe's decision to radically adapt to the Trump administration was, I would say, was and is generally supported by the Japanese public. And the reason is that the first one is pretty straightforward. But if you think about the security situation in Northeast Asia and what Japan can actually do to counter or deal with these trends. I'm talking about China. Right? Everybody in Northeast Asia, for that matter, everybody around the world is worried, concerned, interested in China's rise. And the situation that we're in is very different from Europe because, yes, Europe is facing not the rise, but threat. I can't come out with the right word. It's the uncertain aggressiveness of Russia. That's a worry for many European countries. But Russia is not a surging or rising power, right? And also, if you look at Europe, France, UK, Germany, they have friends. They have multilateral institutions. So yes, U.S. is indispensable, right, in terms of managing NATO, and U.S. has to be there. But you look around, you share many countries who almost, or more or less share the same kind of worries about Russia. And I think it's a bit different in case of Northeast Asia, because we don't, and I would add that many or most of the countries in Asia, Northeast Asia and beyond, including Southeast Asia, is worried about China's rise, concern that they may have, hegemonic ambitions. And if you pile up what China is doing, you may see an ambition of building a China-centric order. But there's another perception that, especially these smaller and mid-sized countries, that you can't shape China's rise. Then you might as well adapt to it. Don't fight with them. Right? There's that kind of, although they are worried, they are at the same time, faced with a very serious choice of or no choice of simply adapting to sort of China's rise. But Japan is not in that category. I would say it is maybe the only country who is explicitly saying that China-centric order is not desirable in the Northeast Asia or Asia Pacific region, and we would resist to that if we see that kind of order surging. But the thing is, we can't do that alone, right? It's almost impossible. So we need a partner. So that partner is the United States. And I think there's a general understanding and support about that. There was an interesting poll conducted by the Cabinet Office of Japan. If you ask the state of the U.S.-Japan relations today, excellent and good, if you add those two categories, last year it was 84.4%, pretty high. And this year, in 2017, it was 84.4, right, pretty high. And in 2018, it dropped quite significantly, 10%, 74.3%, which is still high. But there you can show that Japanese people are a bit worried about American commitment to the region. But the next polling is, if you ask the people in Japan for the future shape of the region, how important is the U.S.-Japan relationship? In 2017, it was 95.1%, and in 2018, it was 94.5%. It's almost identical, right? And a number over 90%, 2 years in a row. In fact, it goes much longer. Is not a number what you get in a democracy, right? So the importance of U.S. Relations with the U.S. is, I would say, near consensus in Japan. So people understand that no matter who the president is, you somehow have to deal with him or her. So that's the consensus. The second element that the Prime Minister Abe decided to sort of adapt to Mr. Trump, and the reason why the Japanese public supported it, was sort of the lack of populism you see in other Western democracies. Professor Lin has written an excellent article on that in Asia Pacific Review. If you see a close to anger among the leaders in UK, France, and Germany, it's not simply about President tweeting and making policies at the same time. I think they see sort of the darker side of what Mr. Trump represents, right? It resonates with AfD, Alternative for Germany. They resonate with Le Pen to a certain degree. It resonates with Brexit. And all these, people in UK, Germany, and France who support these negative nationalist, populist tendency are in support of Mr. Trump, and sort of vice versa to a certain degree. So those leaders in Europe are really disturbed by what Mr. Trump represents and the fact that he doesn't criticize them. Right? But in Japan, we see none of that. None of this. Of course, we're a democracy. There's fringe elements who make very nationalistic messages and populist messages and all that. They do exist, but is there a major trend towards that? There isn't. Right? The reason is mixed, I guess, because Japan is a homogeneous society. We have a border in form of, or a wall in form of a sea. Right? No one can just swim across the Sea of Japan and come to Japan, or for that matter, Pacific Ocean. I mean, it's almost impossible, right? So and also there's other elements, I guess. In the political sphere, social media is not that active. In the private and the social sphere, it is. People tweet, and we have our own, not our own, it's a Korean thing, but it's called Line, which is a social network service, really popular among the younger generation. But it somehow hasn't penetrated the political sphere, the public sphere. And people actually do read the newspaper. Yes, the number of the publication of the newspaper are going down, but if you compare with the other countries, the number of people who read the newspaper is still quite high, although the newspaper companies are really worried about the decline. So these lack of populism makes Japan unaware of the darker side of Mr. Trump. Right? Not that we don't care, but more we don't really realize that danger. Right? And the third is, I don't mean any offense, but Mr. Trump to many Japanese are your typical American, right? It's what you see on TV, movies, and all that. Again, no offense, but maybe arrogant, loud, brash, and that's, in a way, good side of the U.S., but a negative side. And so a person who knows American society would be surprised, people who have lived in the States would be surprised that Mr. Trump was elected. But of course, quite naturally, many of the Japanese have never lived in the United States. So they would think, Mr. Trump is a typical American. And lastly, the reason why we supported Prime Minister Abe's decision to adapt to Mr. Trump is a contrast with President Obama. I've sort of touched on this a little bit at the outset, that we always accept a tough leader in, supreme or the commander-in-chief of the United States. And President Obama was never a tough commander, at least in our perception. If you look at the, U.S., the White House has to come out with a document called National Security Strategy. And the National Security Strategy of 2015 was, there was a term in the cover letter which says that, the strategic patience is the mode that U.S. has to be in. And if you read the documents, those policy document goes, it goes this way and that way, it has many messages. But the message that it sort of, made an impression on us was that American primacy is no longer a solution to the kind of problem that U.S. is facing. It's in a way true. To deal with pandemics and global warming, American primacy is not the answer. And he thought, issues like pandemics and global warming are existential threat to the United States and to the humankind, and never treated the rise of China or Russia as an existential threat. It was a threat, but so that's why people sometimes call him a postmodern president, right? And intellectually, I think that makes sense to a certain degree. But for many of the Japanese, and many who lives in Northeast Asia, yes, pandemics, global warming is something that's really important. We have to sort of deal with it. But in Northeast Asia, what we're facing is a modern sort of situation. Clash of nations, right? China's rise, North Korean nuclear weapons. When you're faced with those kind of issues, the intellectual sophistication of President Obama wasn't convincing. And the message that at least it was mixed because we weren't sure how he was going to approach China. We were not sure if he's even interested in nuclear weapons in North Korea. But that made us think that maybe we couldn't rely, or we weren't fully convinced with President Obama's message. Maybe we can somehow manipulate Mr. Trump. So that was the expectation. And also, the personal chemistry between Prime Minister Abe and Mr. Trump helped a lot. I mean, this is, I guess, almost against the diplomatic protocol, but Prime Minister Abe visited President-elect not even 2 weeks after, it was like 11 or 12 days after the presidential election, he visited him in Trump Tower and talked about the coming presidency. I hear that the Obama White House was extremely unhappy with it because it is against the diplomatic protocol. You only have one president, and the Japanese prime minister is not supposed to sort of have a talk with a president-elect. But he did that anyway, and we have, I think, fairly managed the relations pretty well. So, but if you think about the other options that Japan may have, just think of the possibilities. You could sort of, or you would understand why Japan sort of tried to adapt to Mr. Trump in that radical mode. Because I think there's like 5 other options that you can think of. Some may not be realistic, but sort of a brainstorming mode. You could choose the pacifist route, right? Which is actually in our Constitution, Article 9. No more alliance. We're going to get rid of our sort of military capabilities and become a pacifist nation. But that's almost out of the question. I mean, no one today would support that idea. It's even irresponsible, right? Just disarming yourself totally in Northeast Asia would create a vacuum that would sort of bring in a conflict. So I don't think no serious person would support that. Then what about Japan becoming a full-blown military power? Right? That's also not supported among the Japanese public. Where's the money? There's no money for that, and there's no political will. And the political class and the politicians would never try to convince Japanese people into that direction because it's almost out of the question. It's not possible. Going nuclear, some people talk about it, but it's unrealistic. Maybe some other allies other than the United States. We've been working on sort of what we call the networking of the alliances. We've been trying to establish or deepen the connection between U.S. allies in the regions like Australia. India is not an ally, but a partner, potential partner. That's becoming much more important. Even France, we have a foreign minister and defense minister meeting, which is called 2+2, and UK, which is feeling a bit lonely these days. They want to. We're even talking about the alliance. We had a good alliance, before the war with the UK. So UK is sort of hinting that. But would the Indian Navy come to help us in defense of our territories in East China Sea? That's unthinkable, right? Only the U.S. forces would be willing to do that. There's some questions, though. So other allies is not a realistic option. Maybe some regional organizations. There are regional organizations in our region, but some people talk of them as though if it's only a talk shop. It doesn't really go into the substance and the difficult matters. There's the global organization UN and the UN Security Council that is supposed to uphold the norms and global order and all that, but quite naturally, China is the only one in the Security Council as a permanent member with a veto power in it. We've been trying to become a permanent member since the early 1990s. We've been raising hand every year all the time, but China and some others have been really successful in avoiding that. So that's also not a possibility. So as a result of that, it's quite natural for Japanese people to think that U.S. option is the only option that we have. But lucky thing for us is that, yes, it is the only option, but it's the best option, I guess. So that's why, more than 90% of the people think that, relations with the United States is critically important. But I think you can say the same thing, in a different way, that it's the best choice for the U.S. as well, right? For the U.S. to thrive, and of course, transatlantic relations is always important. That's where U.S. sort of started out, but in terms of trade, economy, and all that, it's nice to go to Europe and have wine, cheese, and go to museums, but that's not where the real economic dynamisms are, right? It's in Asia Pacific, East Asia, so it's good for U.S. to be there. But the thing is, you've been functionally part of East Asia since maybe late, 19th century, or definitely from the early 20th century. But you're not physically present there. So you would need a partner there. You would have many potential partners. You have forces in Korea, Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, although it's down under further away, Australia. They have fought in every wars that you have fought, but they're a bit too down under south, right? And South Korea, they have this strain of, anti-American sentiment. Philippines, the same. You have a president like Duterte. It's a bit, Trumpier than Mr. Trump himself. So Japan is a stable democracy. We've successfully managed the alliance for more than, or close to 7 years. And there are no major sort of anti-base movement. There was some, and of course there are some issues in Okinawa. Local frustration is there. But in terms of national sentiment, this anti-base movement is almost non-existent since the mid-70s, right? So it's been almost 40 years since we've last had the major movement, social movement in countering the U.S. presence. And we also shared the desirable shape of regional order. So I think no doubt it's a best power for the U.S., best option for the U.S. So it's for Japan, adapting to Mr. Trump wasn't all that controversial. But I guess the question is will America sort of still sort of remain to be an upholder of regional order, liberal international order, and would America still pursue sort of American primacy? If you lose interest in that, the alliance or the relations with the U.S. wouldn't sort of stop making sense, even in the Japanese context. So what worries us the most, and this is counterintuitive, but sort of the continuity between Obama and Trump. I make this argument in Washington. Nobody likes this. When I talk to the Trump people, they would say, no, we're not like Obama. And of course, when I talk to the Obama people, don't equate us with Trump, right? But I'm sort of doing this as an argument to make a point. And so if you distill three core agendas of Obama's foreign policy, it was about asking allies and partners to do more. Right? In fact, the reason why Japan took a major security reform in 2012-13 period was, yes, it was about China, it was about North Korea, but it was also about the U.S. commitment. We weren't quite sure about the U.S. commitment. So therefore, we would beef up what we can do in the the national security area and try to convince the Americans that we have done our maximum within our legal framework. So you have to be committed to the region as well. We could never say this publicly, because if we say that people would start saying even Japan doesn't trust the United States, right? But that was sort of like the hidden message. So we literally felt that, I think. And of course, this 2%, defense spending, NATO, partners on that, Mr. Trump is making noise all the time. This is not a Trump agenda, but a Obama agenda. Well, in fact, it started out in the Bush administration. But so, demanding allies and partners to do more. That was a clear vision of the Obama foreign policy. And the second, and maybe this is the core of the Obama agenda, no more unneeded intervention, and that U.S. should basically pull back and focus more on the United States. That would be the third element, right? Nation building at home. So I think that's the three pillars of the Obama foreign policy agenda. And I'm not saying Trump and Obama is totally the same, because in terms of issues like global warming, how you deal with the UN, those are totally different. Right? But these three pillars that I talked about, demanding allies and partners to do more, no more intervention, and nation building at home, I think it totally overlaps with what Mr. Trump wants as well. In case of Mr. Trump, nation building is about building walls and sort of pushing back unwanted elements to enter into the country. So it's and in case of President Obama, it was Obamacare. So it's totally different. But sort of the direction, or at least the message, you could make an argument that there are some continuities. And if there are continuity between these two very different presidents, one, I may call him a smart retrencher. Obama understood the negatives of America retrenching, so he tried to fill the void with the notion of global governance and sort of America being proactive in multilateral sort of organization. And in case of Trump, he was just blunt and said, we're going to pull out, we're not going to do this anymore. So there's many differences. But at least on our side, there seems to be a continuing thread between the two very different presidents. So if that is so, if that is a larger tendency that the American society as a whole is heading, that would be a great challenge for Japan. Because without the U.S. commitment and U.S. commitment to uphold liberal international order in our region, the alliance won't function as we hope to be. So I don't think we're at that stage yet. We're sort of feeling, or we're becoming a bit nervous, but people are talking about it. But for now, even under Trump, Mr. Trump, what we're focused on is trying to convince the Americans that you have to be a resident power. We will sort of try to uphold our responsibilities. And that element has been almost totally what we've been doing in the Obama administration. So yes, I said it was a radical adaptation, but it isn't all that different. And I think that is unique to Japan. You don't see that in Europe. But so that's how we sort of managed and navigated through, and we're still navigating through, and we don't know whether we would successfully do that for 4 years, and who knows if it's 8. But we've been, I think, quite successful in managing that. So that will be the end of my talk. Thank you very much. Sorry I went on a bit too long. Apologies for that.
All right, let's just have a seat and we'll take some questions. Here, can you sit on that side? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to grab the first question to get us going. So I wanted to follow up on a theme that you mentioned about China's, like a Chinacentric order. And you talked about the theme of international order and how important it was to Japan that this international liberal order is upheld, and the fear that the United States is no longer as interested and committed to upholding that order. And also the notion of a China-centric order and what that would entail and how it would be different and alarming to Japan. So can you give us some insight in terms of what are Japanese people saying about the direction of China's leadership,
Right.
and why do you see that as not in
Right.
your interest?
Well, first of all, I think I said in my remarks that Japan, in a certain context, would feel lonely because we would be the only one who would explicitly resist, China-centric order. So if you pile up what China is doing in South China Sea, East China Sea, even some domestic arrangement, with the social media and all that, you feel the dangers of that. We're not quite sure what kind of order that is, but what we're saying that we have to be fully aware of the negative side of China-centric order. And if we see that kind of order, it would most likely be that Japan would feel quite possibly isolated. And if you add an American retrenchment in that picture, the smaller countries have no option but to adapt to the China-centric order. So we would be relatively alone in resisting that kind of order. So that's sort of like the worst case scenario. And but in more practical terms, East Asia has recovered or has developed precisely because this open and liberal market-based liberal order. And China, in fact, has benefited that.
So has China.
Right. So they should be the one who should be sort of upholding that kind of order. But they see a liberal international order as a euphemism. Right? They think it's an American order. And I was having some discussion with Chinese colleagues in Beijing, and I sort of, without any thinking, because I use the term all the time, I used the term liberal international order without precisely defining them. And they accused me of, not to use that word because that is an American-led order. And we don't like that. So Japan benefited. And in fact, we rose within that order. And we feel comfortable in it, and we think it's good for the region. So the fact that order being eroded is bad for us, bad for the region. So that's the kind of argument that I was trying to make.
So are things like, you mentioned the South China Sea, so the going against maritime law, for example, the militarization of islands and the doubt that would cast on the freedom of navigation and freedom of the movement of goods throughout the region.
Right.
You mentioned the social media. Are you talking about their own treatment of
own
people
treatment,
in China?
their own people, and how that would extend outward, possibly? We don't know. So it's not going to be a rule-based, region or area if a China-centric order really emerges. So at least our notion is that we have to sort of resist and push back. But unfortunately, we can't do that alone. Collectively, we should, we should be partnering with many other countries in the region. But of course, as many of us know, Southeast Asia, although they're very worried about China's rise, their position is don't make us choose between China and US and Japan. Right? They want to be in the middle because for them, the term that they use is geography is a fate. You can't move China, but America can always pull back. And we can't fully rely on the US. And Japan cannot single-handedly cope with the situation. So they themselves are in a pretty precarious situation, I think.
Very true. Why don't we take some questions from our folks back here? So I see right back here in the last row. Yeah. Good. Buell. Yeah. Can you? Oh, sorry. I guess we're passing the microphone around.
You talked about like how it's important for Japan to kind of strengthen the relationship with U.S. and also diversify the like ally relations with other countries. And you briefly talked about South Korea and the relationship between Japan and South Korea. But I feel like, to me, even though like all the like historical things that happened between Japan and South Korea, it would be hard for Japan and South Korea to be kind of close. But I feel like it feels to me it'd be beneficial for both if Japan is really against a China-centric order. Since South Korea is also a U.S. ally, wouldn't it be beneficial for both, and especially Japan, to kind of get close to Korea to kind of, I guess, hinder the rise of China?
Right.
But the current situation between the two doesn't seem like it's going that way, but that's like further and further away from being close. So I would like to hear from you about your personal opinion about the future of the two relations.
I totally agree with your analysis that most of us would understand the importance of good relations between Korea, ROK, and Japan. Right? And there was this term quite often used back in the late 1980s, the virtual alliance. Right? There's ROK is an ally to the U.S. and Japan is an ally to the U.S. So why not sort of try to forge a trilateral, not a formal alliance, but a virtual alliance, so that we can work together. So that was the ambition. But nobody talks about that anymore. And there are many reasons behind that. And some are very emotional. But some are, I think, more strategic in nature, I think, because that would sort of relate to what I said, answering to Professor Lin's question. Everybody in the region is worried about China's rise and trying somehow to cope with it. Right? And of course, South Korea is worried or concerned about how they would adapt to China. And I think their understanding is that they can balance between their relations with China and their relations with the US. But if you bring in the Japanese part of it, for their future in East Asia, I think they see China as much more significant than Japan is. I'm not saying that there is a consensus on that, but large portion of the Korean public are seeing Japan in that light. And this is an if situation, so I don't know whether it would make sense, but Japan's population is going down quite significantly. Right? Now we have like 1,100 million people, but it would go down to like 90 million, to that range in the coming future. And if we see a unified Korea, it would be a very rocky period, I think. But the population would be somewhere like 60 million people, or a bit less, or a bit more than that. So in terms of the size of a nation, it would be more or less the same. And I think the competition would be more fierce between Japan and Korea. So, and of course, in the process of unification, I'm sure the Koreans would use the Japan card, because the easiest thing that you can do to unify a people is to say that person is bad, right? I mean, we do that in the elementary school, and we do that at the nation level as well. It's kind of sad, but that's how it goes. And and as a result of all that, as a result of all that, we used to talk about our feeling towards Korea, because all this talks about reconciliation, apologies, always doesn't work out, partly because of them, partly because of our fault. We quite often talked it as that we have the Korean fatigue. Right? We're tired of it. Right? But nowadays, people talk of distrust towards the Korean people. I hope that will recover. But when our defense minister was in Washington recently, he talked about potential new partners in terms of security. He meant, and he talked about Australia. He talked about India, UK, France, without mentioning South Korea. So intellectually, I do agree with what you said. That is critically important. But it seems like it's not, going toward the direction, and it's difficult to imagine a situation where, this three alliance or the three countries would function in a very productive way. It's kind of sad, but that's, I think, where we're at.
Other questions? Yeah, back here.
I actually have a similar question about another regional sovereign power, and that is like Taiwan, because Taiwan is a U.S. Ally, kind of.
I guess partner.
Yeah, partner, I'd say, but who's also shown resistance to the rise of China,
Right,
and obviously has ties with Japan. How do Japanese people see the Taiwan-Japan relationship continuing in the future in opposition to China? Because U.S.-Taiwan relations is definitely a thorn in China's side.
Right.
So I just want to know what the Japanese opinion is on Taiwan.
Well, in terms of, person-to-person, people-to-people ties, I think, the affinity towards the Taiwan people in Japan and vice versa is quite strong. Like many of my friends, colleagues loves going to Taiwan. And there are some issues between, Taiwan and Japan, but it doesn't really all that serious. So, and of course, the fact that we share, a concern about the rise of China helps the relation as well. But in terms of political and foreign policy and security sphere, we are much more cautious than the United States. I was at one senator's event, a Republican, very conservative, hawkish type. This was an open event, so there was a participant from a Taiwan media, and he asked this senator that, are you going to support President Tsai delivering a speech at the joint session of Congress? And he said, definitely, I would support her fully. Well, it doesn't mean that's going to happen. But in Japan, I mean, we try to sort of handle the situation in a more quiet manner and not try to sort of, arouse Chinese anger too much. So there's a difference in tone in how we approach the issue itself. But in terms of, like I said, people-to-people relations, it's quite good. It's nothing like what we have with Korea or mainland China. It's totally different. It's good, I would say. And I think people in Taiwan demand us to do more. But it's kind of politically, delicate, and I don't think there will be a significant movement on that front.
Of course. Yeah. Rachel?
Hi, thank you so much for coming. I was just wondering about Japan and the Japanese public's reaction to China's more like soft power rise, especially to programs like the BRI and to institutions like the AIIB, and if there's a sense of like a loss of financial opportunity that goes in with those, or possibly an attempt to counteract those sort of policies.
Well, thank you. In terms of BRI and AIIB, initially, I think Japanese government and Japanese people, for that matter, was extremely worried because of the financial power that it seemed to have and seemed to back the whole program up. And we saw that as a tool for realizing Chinese hegemonic ambitions, right? So we were extremely worried. But it turns out it's been a couple of years since the program was launched. It has an element of the paper tiger in it. It's not as effective as it seemed. many of the project and initiative that launched under the banner of BRI is stuck. So I think the position of the Japanese government is that in a place where we can cooperate on like infrastructure building, I mean, we would be willing to do so. So that, I think, extreme worry is more or less toned down. And that sort of resonates with the Japanese position on China these days, that the two nations are trying to come together, not totally amend, but at least, I mean, for the past 7 or 8 years, Japan-Sino relation was really bad, right? Mainly because of the territorial issues, but much more than that. But I think there's an understanding on both sides that maybe we should start to sort of cool off a bit. And now, and Prime Minister Abe visited Beijing last year, and President Xi is supposed to visit Japan early summer. So I think we're in a direction where we're not going to become friends or anything. It's on the security front. There are many issues that we have to resist and and stand firm. But in areas that we can cooperate, I think there's a mood in Tokyo that we might or we should cooperate with China. But that may sometimes, because of the recent U.S. hard stance on China. Maybe some of you have heard President Pence's speech in Washington, Hudson Institute, really tough on China, treating it almost as an adversary, not a competitor even, an enemy or adversary. That's how China was treated in the Mike Pence speech. And we always demanded U.S. that you have to be tough on China, because sometimes it seemed like, especially like during the first years of the Obama administration, it seemed like, at least from our point of view, they were trying to engage China without being tough. Try to shake hands was the sole object. At least that's how it seemed. So we always kept saying that China is with its hegemonic ambitions. You have to be careful. We've been saying that all the time, and the Americans would say, "We understand that. Don't overreact. Watch what we're doing. We're also tough." But now we're in a situation that be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. And U.S. seems to be approaching China in a really tough way. Even, like I said, even as an adversary. And we don't want to see U.S. and China fighting all the time. Maybe war is the last thing we want, right? So we're now a bit worried about that. The other worry that we're facing recently.
So the rhetoric has definitely shifted. So you're talking about
In Japan.
in the U.S.
In the U.S.,
Vice
yeah.
President Pence's speech,
Right.
and then of course there's the trade war, and so
Right.
we see actual policy changes.
Right,
Are there other things that are
Yes.
starting to
What-
alarm the Japanese?
What struck me, listening to the Mike Pence speech, was that it sort of resembled the X article of George Kennan. In that, because George Kennan was making the argument that Russia or the Soviet is penetrating us. And they're trying to sort of undermine U.S. from within. That wasn't precisely George Kennan's message. He's a Russian expert. He understood where Russia is. So it was about, don't overreact. We should wait for its own demise. But the reason why it penetrated the American foreign policy establishment was the penetration metaphor, that Soviet is undermining U.S. from within. And the Pence speech had the same kind of logic, that China is not just out there being dangerous, it's penetrating our society. It's stealing our technology from within. And we have to get rid of that and counter that. So that resemblance in logic was, I think, very interesting. And some people say that we shouldn't be using the word Cold War to describe, China-U.S. relations today. But I think, in a way, it makes sense. Because in the media, when people use the term Cold War, they treat it as though the next stage is the hot war, right? So we're not at that stage, so just avoid using the term Cold War. But the term Cold War was not about that. It was about realizing that hot war is impossible or very difficult because of the nuclear weapons, right? And especially in the 1970s, it was about managing a very difficult relation with a country which you can never become friends with. So maybe the Cold War analogy is precisely the term you might need, because realistically speaking, US and China is not going to be like buddies. That's extremely difficult, right? So it's going to be a difficult partner. So we should realize that and try to stabilize that. At the same time, avoid war at any cost. So in that context, I think the term Cold War totally makes sense.
To the extent that it's referring to intensification of the competition that
Right,
we're seeing,
right,
I think
right.
it's applicable.
Right.
This is being very roundly debated in international politics these days, with many people saying this is a really imprecise analogy. And of course, there's many differences with the Cold War.
Right,
The
sure.
extent of economic globalization and interdependence, for example, the interconnectedness of the U.S. and Chinese societies. So there's many differences, but there is certainly more intense competition that we're starting to see, and so in that respect, we do see some similarities. Yeah, right here.
Thanks very much for your comments. Given the somewhat erratic American policy in Asia and the longer-term trend towards populism, let's say it goes on for another 5 or 10 years, plus the greater importance of Asia economically versus North America, is there you mentioned your 5 different doors, is there a door number 6 where, is it in Japan's interest perhaps to go down what I'll call a Switzerland strategy or even a Finlandization strategy, where Chinacentric is going to be the reality? Let's cozy up to that early, shape it. Sort of like the debate between the UK and EU. Should I be inside and influencing it, on the outside pushing it back?
Yes, I think there's, the other thing, the people who's managing the alliance are called alliance managers. Some people call it the alliance mafias because they're so closed, right? They're like the gangs. And Professor Lind is in there, yes.
Are we in that? I was just thinking that. We're not closed. They let me in, for goodness sake.
Yeah. Well, you were at the Mount Fuji dialogue. But anyhow, so the mindset of this, the security mafia, especially on the Japanese side, is to stop thinking beyond the alliance, because there isn't any. Right? So to become a card-carrying member of the security mafia, just don't think about it, because it doesn't make sense.
I think we call it the blob here, right, in the U.S.
What's that?
The foreign policy elite is called the blob.
Okay.
Sort of idea.
Okay. But in a way, that made sense for Japan. Precisely the reason why I explained. I mean, it's nice to think about, speculate about beyond the alliance, but realistically, there isn't any. So just stop thinking about it. And initially, I think this don't think beyond mentality was an intellectual sort of, it was intentionally done, right? So it was a decision not to think about it. But now people don't even realize that they stopped thinking beyond the alliance. So it has almost become a routine. And some people do criticize the security mafia's insistence on not thinking beyond the alliance as unrealistic in the age of populism and in the age of Trump. But in a short term, I still agree that there is no option beyond the alliance. So what I would say is that, so Japan is it's kind of sad to say this, but Japan is a country without plan B. But we do have sort of like plan A dash, right? And that's, yes, we would focus on the alliance, and that would never change. But that doesn't mean that we would follow everything that US does. We would, as we did, we kept the TPP alive. Although we're not, we're not a member of JCPOA, we think that arrangement is critically important, and we're pretty vocal about it. That's same with the Paris Agreement. EPA with EU, that's critically important. We're very sort of active in multilateral diplomacy, development. So those issues that we would handle. We would not like follow everything that US is doing. And that's been a constant. I mean, that's been the same. And in a way, Japan have developed a peculiar kind of realism, sort of, trying to manage the US-Japan relations, right? You've been always a bigger partner, way bigger. So the Japanese people have learned to adapt to this our partner, and not feeling that negative about it. I mean, it's a fact of life. I mean, you have to adapt to it. So, I mean, if it's another country, I mean, you would feel sort of like an emotional, frustration in trying to adapt to the U.S. But we've become numb in a way, or you can call that a realism. And there's a term, shoganai, that's like, I mean, you'd have to accept it. That's the Japanese term for you'd have to accept it. So I call that a shoganai realism, right? I mean, we have to deal with it. So that sentiment is still strong. But like you said, if the populism trend continues, and if we have a sophisticated Trump, or if we have really progressive, on the left side, president who is not interested in upholding, liberal international order, I'm sure Senator Sanders is not too, enthusiastic about U.S. playing a positive role abroad. And that might be even more, worse nightmare for Japan. So we see the possibilities. But as of now, we shouldn't overreact to it. And what we should be doing is to demand U.S., like I said in my remarks, that we should demand U.S. to be a resident power. And that's precisely the role that we're being demanded by our friends in the region. Japan would be the most effective nation to convince the Americans that you're important and you have to be here. And as of now, at least at the policy level, we don't see any of that. But there are worries in American body politic because in a way, Mr. Trump's message is resonating. The fact that you've been sort of responsible for liberal international order since the end of Cold War, and people expected that liberal international order would converge, that China would join in, Russia would join in, and the end of history, right? But that's not the way it's turning out. And I think the sentiment is that, do we still have to do this? I guess that sentiment is quite strong, and it goes way beyond the core Trump supporters.
America has some fatigue of its own, maybe.
Right, yeah. So we're worried about that. But we can't do much about that, right? I mean, just keep on convincing.
Do we have more questions? I think.
Yeah, this is one, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Martha. Right there.
In this week's Economist, they have an article talking about the islands off northern Japan that are now occupied by Russia.
Right.
Right, and it mentions that there have been 25 meetings between Putin and Abe. You haven't mentioned much about Russia's role in the region. Could you say a few words on that?
Sure. Well, in foreign policy terms, there are some legacy agendas that Prime Minister Abe is trying to pursue. Abduction issue in North Korea is one. Sort of constitutional reform, which I don't think it's going to happen, is another. And the third is the Northern Territory issue with Russia. And yes, they've met 25 times. Is it 25? Yeah, something around that. Yeah, and among the conservatives, getting back the Northern Territory is one of the core agendas, because territorial issues is always quite an emotional issue. But not many people understand the strategy behind what Prime Minister Abe is doing. And frankly, I don't understand that either. Russia has been using sort of like a double, I might get in trouble for saying this because my program is assisted by the Cabinet Office of Japan. But they don't restrict me in whatever I would say, so I can say whatever I want. But they're using this like a double track diplomacy. The Putin is rather soft. I mean, he hints that there might be some breakthrough. But at the foreign minister level, that's Lavrov, right? He's the true, like he was the ambassador when I was working at, it was a Russian ambassador when I was working at the UN at a junior officer. And he is really tricky, really tough. And his position that he conveys to the Japanese counterpart foreign minister is always tough. We're not going to give back the islands. The peace treaty is first. So it's a very mixed message. And it seems like Prime Minister Abe is totally relying on President Putin's message. But, we're not sure where that's going. And, so that's why I haven't really mentioned, I'm not saying that it's unimportant, but I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I don't think anything is going behind the scenes. It seems like we're being manipulated by the Russian side, but who knows? But in general, I think people are interested in that subject. And because it's a territorial issue, it's about national sovereignty, it is always important, but it isn't as emotional as some other issues like the abduction or the Senkaku Island, which is the island in East China Sea, where we're having some difficulty with China. So I couldn't really answer your question in a crisp way, but that's how.
It's mainly limited to that issue,
Oh, you mean vis-a-vis Russia?
the relationship between Japan and Russia.
No, there are some potential. I mean, compared to other sort of Western democracies in Europe, we have a rather stable relations, except for these territorial issues. And some see a positive possibility with development in the bilateral sort of relations with Russia. So that is a bit different. And we were always nervous about Japan being criticized by the US for being too close to Russia. But now you have a president who seems to favor President Putin. So
we have time for one more question. And Robert, you had your hand up?
So I just wanted to talk about something that's been in the news recently, the North Korean nuclear negotiations. Okay. I'm wondering, from a Japanese perspective, is there a fear that in negotiating with Kim, Trump may, for instance, say we'll accept giving up ICBMs but leave medium-range and short-range missiles and leave the threat to Japan? So is there a concern that the U.S. may bypass Japan in these negotiations, and what would the Japanese response or policy be?
Well, precisely the point you mentioned is the serious concern. The mid and short-range missiles would be taken off the table, and only sort of ICBMs being discussed. That's a huge concern. But I guess that we would keep on demanding, the American, team, and Mr. Trump for that matter. I think Prime Minister Abe is going to talk with Mr. Trump on the phone, before the bilateral between Kim Jong-un, and I think he's going to demand that point, abduction issue, and don't back off on the sort of the nuclear disarmament. We're going to press that quite strongly, I guess. But in a case where he doesn't, I think we're not going to overreact. We were under the threat of, North Korean short and middle range missiles for more than close to 20 years right now. We've somehow managed, so I think it's upon us to negotiate with the North Koreans. And I think Prime Minister Abe has shown his willingness to negotiate with the North Koreans. It's going to be a difficult process. I don't think it's going to happen right away. So I think, Japanese government is supposed to be, and I'm sure they are fully informed about what they've discussed. They've already had a high-level trilateral meeting in Seoul about what's being discussed in Pyongyang. And I'm sure they're getting the feel of it. But the thing is, who knows what President Trump is going to sort of agree with, Kim Jong-un. So we're ready for it. We hope that, U.S. sticks to the message. But if it doesn't, I guess our attitude is that we have to take the issue on our own. So that part is a bit different from China, because there's something that we could do. Right? So yeah, that would be my answer.
So I have one last quick question. I have found from dealing with people in my Alliance Mafia, I guess, that everybody has a really interesting and often wonderful story about how they got interested in Japan and vice versa. And so I went to high school. When I was in high school, I went to Japan with my jazz band. And so that's how I got interested in Japan. And here I am. So I want to ask you what your story is. I know you were an exchange student in the United States.
Well, yeah. Well, I lived in the U.S. before that in the 70s, but that was when I was in elementary school. So I do remember, but it didn't have a significant impact on me. But when I was in high school, it was almost, I had no choice. I had to go because my mother kept on insisting that you have to go to the United States to brush up my English.
Okay.
Because I was in elementary school. I did catch the pronunciation, but I didn't have the vocabulary and the skill, so I decided to go. Well, I was forced to go, and I didn't have any choice where to go, and I was sent to South Dakota, Watertown, South Dakota. I was just there a couple months ago.
I'm sure every young Tokyo lad dreams of going to.
And the population then was like 16,000, 16,000, and it was the third biggest city in South Dakota. And my family was a Reagan Democrat, an avid hunter, deeply religious. And I had to wear. I wore a Nike sneaker, but they told me that's not what you wear around here. And so I got a cowboy boots. But the thing was that I didn't have a bootcut jeans, right? So I tucked my jeans in the cowboy boot, and my friend started calling me Ben. Right? I didn't understand why. After I got friend with them, there's this muscle thing, the Ben Gay. So tucking a, and this was the 1980s, right? Early 1980s, South Dakota. And a kid from Tokyo with a cowboy boots, tucking his jeans in the boot. And I told them, my favorite pop star is Prince, because he was from Minneapolis. I thought all the kids there would like it. But Prince was totally out of their taste, right? It was like their favorite band was like Alabama and Willie Nelson. And like Prince says, no way.
So I'm really seeing how you were so drawn to the U.S. based on this picture.
So it was almost like anthropology, right? It wasn't a political science mindset.
Right.
It was more of an anthropology.
The puzzle to be studied.
Right. So in a way, Trump brought me back to that time that we have to understand. Right?
Well, I think that's exactly the place where we should end this tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.